Hey there, thanks for tuning in. I had a question emailed to me about the appearances of Christ in the Old Testament, so I thought I'd answer it with this video. One of the things that Christians have always confessed is that at Christmas, when the Son of God was born of the Virgin Mary, that this was not his first trip to earth. Beginning already in the Garden of Eden and continuing throughout Genesis and then on to the story of Israel, leading all the way through the rest of the Old Testament. Many times, in many ways, and in many forms, the Son of God came down to earth to visit people. Sometimes it was an individual, and sometimes it was a whole company of people. Sometimes the whole nation of Israel. So the Word became flesh at Christmas when Christ was conceived and then born of the Virgin Mary. But throughout the Old Testament, the Word, the Son of God, was coming down from heaven to appear to people, to speak to people, and in one case, even to wrestle with a man, with Jacob. Now, how is this so? Well, the first thing that you need to realize about these appearances of the Son of God in the Old Testament is that they indicate that Christ never wanted to be perceived as simply stuck in heaven, as if he was gazing upon earth from a distance. Instead, he came down to his people. He desired to dwell in the midst of his people, even before his incarnation, even before he became flesh. He wanted to speak to his people. He wanted to give them direction. He wanted to reveal things about himself, even before he became a flesh and blood human being. Now, the way that he did this was in lots of different forms, lots of different kinds of manifestations. So, for instance, to Moses, he appeared in the burning bush as an angel. Now, one thing you have to realize is that the Hebrew word for angel, malach, means messenger. So anytime that you see angel in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word behind that is malach, which means messenger. Now, oftentimes this is what we think of as an angel, the spiritual messenger, but sometimes the messenger is a human being. And sometimes this messenger is the messenger of the Father, the Word of the Father, whom we know as Jesus Christ. So this angel of the Lord, or this Malach Yahweh, this messenger of the Lord or a messenger of the Father, is the Son of God. He comes down oftentimes in some kind of angelic appearance in order to speak to people, just like he spoke to Moses in the burning bush. And just as later he spoke to Joshua when he was on the battlefield. And even later in the book of Judges, this same angel appeared to the parents of Samson when Samson was about to be conceived, to give them instructions about how they were to raise Samson. So throughout the Old Testament, the Son of God appears as this angelic being. He'll be there for a while, he'll speak, he'll do something, and then he will disappear. He also appears in other ways. Sometimes he appears as a pillar of fire or a pillar of smoke, as he did to the whole nation of Israel. Sometimes he appears as a man. I referenced earlier that he wrestled with Jacob. So when Jacob was about to return from his long exile on the banks of the Jabbok River, this man met him. This man was the Son of God. The Son of God was temporarily assuming a human body so that he, for all intents and purposes, seemed just as human as the rest of us, but it was a way that he was condescending to our humanity temporarily in the Old Testament so that he could, in that case, wrestle with Jacob, or in other cases, speak as man to man, person to person with other people. Now, these were not some kind of permanent assumption of humanity on the part of the Son of God. They were temporary, only for a time, only in order that he could speak to his people, appear to them, and in the case of Jacob, to wrestle with him. And then that humanity that had appeared to them would vanish. So sometimes he appears as a man, sometimes as an angel, sometimes he appears as the glory of the Lord or the word of the Lord. So all kinds of different ways the Son of God is temporarily manifesting himself to his people. These are sometimes called a theophany, which is a fancy word meaning an appearance or a manifestation of God. Now, this is critical. As you're reading through the Old Testament, any time that you see God appearing or God speaking, God making himself visible, that's the Son of God. Because he is the one who presents the Father to us. He is the Word of the Father, the glory of the Father, the manifestation of the Father. He is the one through whom the Father communicates with us. That's why he's called the Word, as John at the beginning of his gospel refers to him. So in many times and in many ways, the author of Hebrews says, God spoke to his people of old by the prophets. And some of these many times in many ways was by this appearance of the Son of God. Now, all of this was a preparation for the coming incarnation. In Luther's commentary on Genesis, he talks about how already in the beginning, the Son of God was, as it were, preparing us for his coming incarnation. When you think about it, it makes sense. Throughout the Old Testament, the Son of God was appearing in human form in order that he might whet our appetite for the incarnation. These were like pre-Christmas appearances, so that we might be prepared for his final and his permanent assumption of our humanity in the incarnation. And that's what set the incarnation apart from all of these other appearances in the Old Testament, because when Christ assumed our humanity, when he became flesh and blood, that flesh and blood is his, beginning with his conception and into all eternity. It's not like he sloughs off his humanity when he ascends to the right hand of the Father. He keeps it. So from his conception onward, he is just as human as we are. And he prepares us for this assumption of humanity throughout the Old Testament, as he appeared to his people, spoke with them, interacted with them, in order that he might be in their midst and prepare us for that first Christmas to come. So thanks be to God that we see from Genesis all the way through the rest of the Old Testament, the Son of God in the midst of his people, just like he would finally become flesh and tabernacle among us in his incarnation. Thanks for listening.